So as I was saying, yeah, personally, I would suggest that this age difference in terms of voting behaviour is in fact also a class difference, because older voters can be seen as forming, in some ways, a privileged class compared to the young. Many of them have enjoyed free university education, held secure, well-paid jobs throughout their working lives, own their own homes and enjoy generous pensions. Young people, meanwhile, face precarious employment, huge debts if they go to university, limited pension options, and next to no chance of buying their own house without help from their family. So older voters, forming a privileged class in society which benefits from the status quo, tend, unsurprisingly, to vote for the party of privilege in the status quo, whilst those who are losing out from the current arrangements tend to vote for the party which promises to change them. Now, finally, one other factor which has always had a very strong correlation with voting behaviour is ethnicity. Now, the historical trend has always been for ethnic minorities to be more likely to support Labour and white people more likely to support Conservative. And again, there are several explanations for this. One explanation is once again that the apparent ethnic divide is in fact indicative of a class divide. The argument here is that it is primarily the class identity of ethnic minority communities, which are predominantly working class, which explains their attachment to Labour rather than their ethnic identity per se. Many black and Asian people came to Britain in the decades following the Second World War specifically to do working class jobs in industry, as bus drivers, builders, railway workers and so on. And as a result, black and Asian people are much more likely to be working class than white people. So what appears to be an ethnic divide is in reality a class divide, with ethnic minorities voting according to class, and being overwhelmingly working class, that means voting overwhelmingly for Labour. A second explanation, however, is that Labour have historically been seen as the more progressive anti-racist party, whilst the Conservatives have been seen as a more racially prejudiced party. This was summed up in the slogan used by the Conservative candidate in Smethwick in 1964, "If you want an N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour." It was a Labour government, on the other hand, who introduced the first Race Relations Act in 1965, banning racial discrimination in housing and jobs, which had previously been legal and widespread. And this was after the previous Conservative government had vetoed a similar act at no less than 8 times. Meanwhile, it was a Conservative government who introduced the 1981 British Nationality Act, which is thought to have been introduced specifically to reduce non-white immigration to the UK. Thus, there's been a historic perception that Labour is more at the forefront of combating racism, whilst there remains a lingering colour prejudice in the Conservative Party. This ethnic divide between the parties has always been the trend and continues to be so to this day. However, the extent of the ethnic divide has changed over time. The tendency for non-whites to vote Labour decreased slightly from the 1990s. Up until that point, between 80 and 90% of ethnic minority votes went to the Labour Party. Since then, this proportion decreased slightly. Now, this fits with the idea that ethnic voting habits reflected underlying class differences. As embourgeoisement and the deindustrialization of the UK has proceeded, more people have become middle class, including ethnic minorities, and therefore lost their attachment to the Labour Party. However, since 2010 and especially since 2015, the ethnic divide has been growing again, with support for Labour amongst Bangladeshis, for example, rising from 60% in 2010 to nearly 100% in 2017, with similar, though less pronounced, rises seen also amongst Pakistani and African Caribbean communities. Now, it's hard to explain this rise in terms of class differences. Another explanation is that whilst Labour lost a lot of Muslim votes to the Liberal Democrats after the Iraq War, the Liberal coalition with the Conservatives in 2015 lost them a lot of support. Meanwhile, Corbyn's credentials as an anti-war and anti-racism campaigner may have helped win back those supporters to Labour since he became Labour leader in 2015. In 2017 then, Labour gained 77% of ethnic minority votes but only 37% of white votes, while the Conservatives gained 45% of white votes but only 20% of ethnic minority votes. In other words, white people are more than twice as likely as ethnic minorities to vote Conservative, whilst ethnic minorities are more than twice as likely as white people to vote Labour. So, in conclusion, long-term factors clearly remain significant in determining voting behaviour. There's a strong correlation, for example, between voting behaviour and ethnicity, with over 3/4 of ethnic minority voters voting Labour in 2017, compared to just over 1/3 of white voters. And social class too remains relevant, at least when measured by home ownership, where voting behaviour is significantly different between owners and renters of property. But it is age which now seems to have the strongest correlation with voting behaviour, with the youngest voters more than 3 times as likely to vote Labour than Conservative, and the oldest more than 3 times as likely to vote Conservative than Labour. And it's probably this factor more than any of the others that has the greatest impact on election outcomes, given that there's not only a growing proportion of elderly voters with each new election, but also that old people remain significantly more likely than the young to actually turn out and vote.